Last weekend I released a video that explored how does weight influence riding performance if you keep steady wattage, and there has been a ton of discussions under that video, and many people actually pointed out that it is no watts that matter when riding, it is the watts per kilo, claiming that the heavier riders are usually able to produce bigger watts than the lighter riders. And I found the feedback quite compelling, so I decided to do a follow-up video that would do similar test, so again comparing 70 kilo rider to an 80 kilo rider, but this time not keeping the steady wattage but the steady watts per kilo. In this case, the 70 kilogram rider would ride 175 watts and the heavier one 200 watts, resulting in 2.5 kilos for both. Now, when it comes to watts per kilo, most people will probably know that it is something that matters the most on climbs, as there is the effect of gravity holding you back. But do you actually know how much does it matter there? I decided to do a little experiment, and I ran a poll on my community tab asking if two riders are going to ride the same watts per kilo on a steep climb, which one is going to be faster? The lighter one? The heavier one? Or will their performance be the same? And 50% of people answered that the lighter one will be faster. 28% of people said it would be the same, and only 21% people trusted in the heavier rider. There was, however, one very interesting answer in the comments. Zwifty Zwifter pointed out that the result might actually vary based on how steep the climb actually is, and that inspired me to actually tweak the test a little bit. Since the climbing is actually the most important part of this testing, I decided to do not one but 3 tests on the climbs. One on a pretty shallow climb, one on a steeper one, and one on a very hard, difficult climb. Let's start with the tests that probably have the most predictable outcome. This is the flat test on London Classic route, and once again we are going to compare the total time difference, calculate a 1 hour equivalent, and see how much does it mean in terms of 1 kilogram of difference when you are riding for 1 hour on such terrain. The second test is focused on descending, and it is going from the radio tower on top of the Epic KOM down to the bottom of the Great climb. The interesting thing about this descent is, while it is net negative in terms of elevation gain, there are still some climbing parts on this descent. And now let's move to the most important part of this test, and that's going to be climbing. As I mentioned, there are going to be 3 separate tests. This is the mild climbing one on top of the volcano KOM. It's got an average gradient of about 4%, and the effect of the gravity shouldn't be as severe. The second climbing test is on the grade, and that is actually way more difficult than the volcano KOM. It's got average gradient of almost 9%, and especially the latter parts of this climb are particularly difficult. This is the final climbing test, and here we are visiting the famous radio tower on top of Epic KOM, and this climb, while very short, has an average gradient of almost 13%, so the effect of the gravity is going to be the most impactful here. Once again, I'm finishing the testing sequence with an all-arounder. This is going to be a course that is very reminiscent of your standard Zwift race, and it's going to be the breakfast grits and crits in Scotland. It's about 22 kilometers long and has about 250 meters of elevation, and I have chose this course because I didn't have a badge. So the testing is done, and now let's take a look at the results, and right from the start we can see one thing: the heavier rider actually won everywhere, not only on the flats and on the descent, but also in all 3 climbing tests. The only difference was how big of that advantage actually was. On the flat courses and on the descent, the advantage was somewhere between 8 to 10 seconds per 1 kilogram of weight per 1 hour of riding, while on the climbs it was between 5 and 6 seconds. And what's actually interesting to me is that on the radio tower climb, which was the steepest one, the difference wasn't actually smaller than on the shallowest climb on the volcano KOM. And my theory is it has to do something with the descending part right on the start, where I could have kept more momentum with the heavier rider, but that's just my theory. So now we have seen that if two riders are keeping the same watts per kilo, the heavier rider will actually have better performance no matter where you are riding. And by the way, if you are one of those people who guessed that correctly in the community poll, kudos, because I know that wasn't very intuitive. But how is that possible? Well, on flats and on the descent, it isn't that big of a surprise because the heavier rider simply keeps bigger watts, raw watts, and in the previous video we established that's what mostly matters on this kind of terrain. But what about the climbs? Well, there's actually one more variable that's sort of hidden from plain sight, and that is bike and equipment weight. You are not carrying just your own mass, you're also carrying the weight of your full equipment. On Zwift, that is your bike. Outside, it's everything you are carrying with you. And when that weight of the bike is the same for both riders, the heavier rider will actually end up with more watts per kilo. In our case, both riders were doing the same watts per kilo, 2.5 to be exact. For the 70 kg rider, that meant 175 watts. For the 80 kg rider, that meant 200 watts. But if we add the bike weight into the equation, and let's say that is going to be 7 kilo, let's take a look what effect that is going to have. For the lighter rider going at 175 watts, the final weight is going to be 77 kilos, 70 for the rider and 7 for the bike. Dividing 175 watts by 77 is resulting in true watts per kilo of 2.27. For the heavier rider going at 200 watts, the resulting weight is going to be 87 kilos, 80 for the rider himself and 7 for the bike. Dividing 200 watts by 87 is resulting in the watts per kilo of 2.3. So what's the conclusion? If the heavier rider has an advantage at all times, does it actually make sense to gain weight for performance? Of course not. If that was the case, you would never see light riders like Tadej Pogačar winning Grand Tours. You need to realize one thing. That advantage is applicable only when both riders are doing the same watts per kilo. But the thing is, when you gain weight, you will very rarely see the same relative improvements in terms of your power output. Sure, it might go up, but the increase probably won't be as high as on your weight scale, and that is going to decrease your overall watts per kilo. And that's not the only thing. There is also a limit of what human body is capable of in terms of raw power output. Let's take a look at Tadej Pogačar as an example. His weight is 66 kilos, and when he is climbing in Tour de France, he's doing probably 7 watts per kilo, which means he's doing 462 watts of raw power. But now imagine that Wout van Aert, who weighs 78 kilos, wanted to keep up with Pogačar on that climb. He would need to do about 100 watts more power, raw power output, for the same duration, and that's simply not possible in many cases, and that is the reason why the lightest riders actually dominate the climbing. So what is the takeaway point? Does weight loss still got merit? It does, when you can do it without seriously hurting your raw power output. That is, if you have large percentage of body fat to lose. If you are very muscular and have low percentage of body fat, it will be the best to focus on the training rather than weight loss. See you next time.